Okay, so far so good. I think the Anglophones are still on board. The Francophones are cringing a little bit whenever I do that French guttural medial R, étrangère. Oh God, it's hard. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower, and we are about to go back to the battlefield of Dien Bien Phu and China's first proxy war in a very detailed way. Before we do that, this is another episode where you have to eat your vegetables. Because we're going to start talking about the layout of the battlefield of Dien Bien Phu in excruciating or exhilarating detail. We're going to be talking a lot about particular French units. And I'm going to do that by means of the standard abbreviations that you find all over the literature about the First Indochina War. That means we need to learn a little bit of survival French for military unit designators. To put the real essentials in a memorable nutshell, répétez après moi. A is for Algérien. B is for bataillon. C is for colonial, except after C when it means commando or when it means chasseur or cheval or choc, CHOC, which looks like it should have to do with chocolate, but actually it means shock. Yeah, C is a mess. But that's okay, friends. That's why you have me. Grab some pommes frites, sit back, and let me make this fun for you. When we meet French Union units at Dien Bien Phu, friends, mostly they're going to have a designator consisting of a number followed by usually three letters, occasionally two, and sometimes four. And to help simplify things, I'm only going to talk about the units that we would find at Dien Bien Phu, and even more specifically, the maneuver units. And we'll leave aside the particular artillery units or like the 403rd Military Post Office Company, just the ones that we're going to find defending or counterattacking the outposts. There's a larger alphabet for dealing with the whole French army at this point that we don't need to go into. Because unless you're planning on starting any wars in metropolitan France, you won't need that knowledge. So in these unit acronyms, the first letter is going to tell you what kind of unit it is. And in Indochina, it's almost always a B for bataillon. Occasionally, we will meet a unit that starts with a C. It's just an independent company. At Dien Bien Phu, a really important one is going to be the first CEPML, La Première Compagnie Étrangère Parachutiste de Mortier Lourd, the first foreign parachute heavy mortar company. That's the C. Occasionally, we'll see reference to a larger formation that starts with a G, a group. We've mentioned before that outside of Dien Bien Phu, especially in eastern Tonkin and the Red River Delta around Hanoi, the conduct of the land war in French Indochina was mostly carried out with groups, which were brigade-sized all-arms task forces. Typically, these will be either a GM, a mobile group, or a GAP, an airborne group. Sometimes we also see units in Dien Bien Phu that start with an R for a régiment. In the Indochina theater at this time, big fighting was done mostly battalion by battalion. And so in Indochina, regiments were mostly administrative grouping, but they come into play at Dien Bien Phu mostly with the Legion, because some of the battalions were housed in larger regiments that gave them their names. So, for example, we'll see this or that battalion of the 5th Regiment or the 3rd Regiment of the Foreign Legion Infantry. We'll meet them in a moment. Most exotic of all is the Demi Brigade, the DB. As I understand it, that was a formation that had its origin in Napoleonic times, but there are still one or two units in the modern French army that still maintain the tradition of being called Demi Brigade, notably the 13th DBLE, the 13th Foreign Legion Demi Brigade. But really, for our purposes, when we see those units show up, we're going to see them as such and such a battalion of the DBLE. So those first letters are quite easy. C is for company, B is for battalion, R is for regiment, G is for group, and D is for demi-brigade. So far, so good for all of us Anglophones. Now, the last letter is also straightforward. Typically, this tells us about the origin of the unit. Remember that within the French Union forces, units tended to be drawn from a particular part of the French Union, which is to say the former French Empire, which was a bit like the British Commonwealth. At the end of an acronym, if you see A, Algérien. If you see M, Moroccan. If you see T, that's Thai, as in the Thai highlands where Dien Bien Phu was located. In French Indochina, there were also Vietnamese battalions. Now, through much of the French army at the time of Dien Bien Phu, there were companies of Vietnamese personnel who were embedded in larger heterogeneous units. But also, I think it was with the founding of the supposedly independent state of Vietnam that a supposedly independent Vietnamese army was formed. And I think it's those battalions that we see marked with the designator BVN, Bataillon Vietnamien. Now, in Dien Bien Phu, the really notable Vietnamese battalion is going to be the 5th BPVN, a Vietnamese Airborne Battalion. More about that P in a moment. Last of all, sometimes you'll see acronyms that end in I for infanterie, infantry, notably the Foreign Legion Infantry Battalion from the 3rd and 5th Regiment. Okay, so that brings us now to the middle letter. The middle letter is usually straightforward, except when it's C, when it could mean almost anything. Sometimes it's easy. At Dien Bien Phu, we see a lot of acronyms where the middle letter is T for tirailleur. These are light infantry, and they usually are Moroccan or Algerian light infantry units. Like they're going to be the stars. And I'm told that sometimes they were kind of like friendly rivals with the Foreign Legion battalions. The Legion is represented by the middle initial E for étrangère, as in Légion étrangère. And a P is for parachutiste, paratrooper. And that P can come in the middle of the acronym or at the end. So for example, at Dien Bien Phu, we meet a lot of Foreign Legion parachute battalions who will be like the première or deuxième BEP for Bataillon étrangère parachutiste. There the P comes at the end. But it can come in the middle too, like the 5th BPVN, where it's Bataillon parachutiste vietnamien. Okay, so far so good. I think the Anglophones are still on board. The Francophones are cringing a little bit whenever I do that French guttural medial R, étrangère. Oh God, it's hard. The tricky part comes with the letter C. Friends, in Dien Bien Phu, almost always C in the middle of a designator means colonial. You remember from an earlier episode that the French army at this time had two completely separate kinds of units. There were the units that belonged to the metropolitan or European French army, and there were the units of what they just called la coloniale, the colonial army that operated outside of the NATO zone. And you'll remember that those units were peopled with lots of French citizens from France, but they had opted to join specifically the colonial army, where they were sure to see a lot of fighting. In the units that will meet at Dien Bien Phu, overwhelmingly, when you see the letter C, it means colonial. And it might come in the middle of the acronym or it might come at the end. So for example, Marcel Bijar's famous battalion, the 6th BPC, the 6th Colonial Parachute Battalion, the Bataillon de Parachutistes Coloniaux. You'll see that acronym, BPC, all over Dien Bien Phu, and it means such and such Colonial Parachute Battalion. Except for when it doesn't. Get ready. It's just that sometimes C doesn't mean colonial, but it means, say, commando. There were units like the 3rd or the 7th BCCP, where the C meant commando. These were units that were descended from SAS-trained or SAS-affiliated World War II Free French units. Prominent among these was Bijar's own battalion. Before he commanded it, when it first was stood up, they were called the 6e BCCP, the 6th Battalion of Colonial Commando Parachutists. And in Indochina, you also had a 3rd BCCP and a 7th BCCP. Okay, still doing pretty well because it's easy to remember that CC has to mean Colonial Commando, but sometimes the C also stands for shock. So, for example, there was a famous 8th BPC, which was an exception to the BPC rule. You see, in their case, the BPC didn't stand for Colonial Parachute Battalion. Rather, at the time of Dien Bien Phu, it stood for Bataillon Parachutiste de Choc, an airborne shock battalion. But friends, don't worry. Nobody will blame you if you mix those up. This channel is a safe space for French C confusion because it can still mean a couple of other things. For example, at Dien Bien Phu, there were some light tanks that were really important and helpful. You wouldn't think that a company of tanks would be a big plus in a sort of like swamp war in a highland mountain valley in the northwest of Vietnam, but damn, those things were useful. Those tanks were technically assigned to an outfit known as the 1st RCC, Régiment de Chasseurs à Cheval, a light cavalry regiment. I don't think anyone ever called them that. At Dien Bien Phu, they were just called the Bisons. But somewhere in an office in Saigon or Hanoi, there was a piece of paper that said they belonged to something called the 1st RCC.
And friends, to help you drill this home, here's a little problem set for you. You can pause here and work this out. If you need help, just let people know in the comments.
Okay, friends, now you know your ABCs. You are ready to look in detail at the fortified garrison of Dien Bien Phu. In the meantime, if you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. You might even visit our Patreon page. But this course remains free to all the world's workers, soldiers, peasants, and tirailleurs. I can't wait to talk to you next time.